You think you could just walk away?
Please stop! You're hurting me!
That's enough.
She walked into the airport to surprise the man who told her to stay home and encountered the man who would regret ever touching her. The glass doors of the international terminal reflected Chioma Ejiofor's determined face, 7 months pregnant in a cream dress that strained gently across her belly, one hand pressed to her lower back as she pushed through the entrance. Behind her, the taxi's red taillights disappeared into the Friday evening traffic. Ahead, the arrivals hall hummed with reunions she wanted to be part of. What Chioma didn't know was that Marcus Green had been watching her since she entered the terminal, and in his 12 years of airport security, he'd learned that pregnant women standing alone always paid quickly to avoid trouble. He had no way of knowing that the woman he was about to extort wasn't alone at all. That the man who loved her was about to walk through customs with enough power to end lives before breakfast. Because sometimes the person who looks most vulnerable in the room is protected by the most dangerous man in the building. And Marcus Green was about to learn that lesson in the most expensive way possible. This is the story of how one act of cruelty destroyed a man's entire life, how a pregnant woman proved that strength has nothing to do with physical power, and how a dangerous man learned that protection without mercy is just another kind of violence. But to understand how we got here, to this moment where everything is about to explode, we need to go back to the beginning. 2 weeks might not sound like a long time, but when you're 7 months pregnant and sleeping alone in a penthouse that feels too big without the person who makes it home, 2 weeks feels like forever. Chioma had tried to be patient. She really had. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 10,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. She'd followed her doctor's orders about bed rest for the high-risk pregnancy. She'd stayed off her swollen feet. She'd watched every streaming series she could find and read books until the words blurred together. She'd even attempted meditation, though sitting still only made her more aware of how much she missed Chun Min-jun's presence, the way he'd rest his hand on her belly and talk to their daughter in Korean, his voice soft in a way the rest of the world never heard. But patience has limits, and Chioma reached hers on day 13. Chun's flight from Seoul was scheduled to land at 6:45 on Friday evening. She'd memorized the flight number, checked the status obsessively, and made her decision somewhere around noon when the loneliness became physical, an ache in her chest that no amount of rational thinking could cure. She knew he'd be angry. Chun had left explicit instructions that she wasn't to leave the penthouse without security, wasn't to exert herself, wasn't to do anything that might risk the pregnancy they'd worked so hard to protect. His head of security, Park, had called twice a day to check on her, his concern genuine even if it felt like surveillance. But love makes you do reckless things sometimes, and Chioma wanted to see his face when he came through those customs doors and found her waiting. She wanted that moment of shock, then worry, then the softness that would follow when he realized she'd come because she couldn't stay away. So she'd called a taxi, ignored 3 calls from Park that she knew were location check-ins, and made her way to JFK. Now, standing in the international arrivals hall with her hand pressed to her lower back and the baby doing acrobatics against her ribs, Chioma felt the first flutter of doubt. The terminal was more crowded than she'd expected, the air thick with the competing smells of coffee, fast food, and too many people in one space. Her feet already hurt in the comfortable flats she'd chosen specifically for this trip. But then she checked her phone and saw that his flight had landed 12 minutes ago, and the doubt evaporated into pure anticipation. Chun would come through those doors any minute now, probably in the tailored black suit he wore for business meetings, probably flanked by his security detail, probably already thinking about the expansion deals he'd negotiated in Seoul. And then he'd see her, and everything else would stop mattering. She positioned herself carefully near the customs exit, found a spot with a clear view but away from the main crush of waiting families. Around her, people held signs and flowers, checked their phones, bounced on their toes with excitement. Chioma just waited, one hand resting protectively on her belly, already imagining the lecture about safety she'd have to endure before he kissed her. What she couldn't see was the man in the airport security uniform watching her from 30 feet away, already calculating how much money he could take before she started crying. If you're wondering how this goes from a sweet reunion to something much darker, make sure you stay with this story because what happens in the next few minutes will change 3 lives forever. Marcus Green had a system, and his system worked. 12 years in airport security had taught him exactly which rules could bend, which travelers made complaints, and which ones just wanted to get home without incident. He'd learned that authority was 90% confidence and 10% the badge on his chest. People saw the uniform and assumed he had power. Most of the time, that assumption was enough. The money started small 3 years ago. $20 here, $50 there, always from people who looked like they'd rather lose cash than waste time arguing. Foreign tourists who didn't understand American regulations. Elderly passengers confused about baggage rules. People who just wanted to catch their connecting flights without drama. Marcus told himself it wasn't really stealing. He was just collecting fines that probably existed somewhere in the massive rulebook nobody actually read. And if those fines went into his pocket instead of airport revenue, well, who was getting hurt? The rationalization got easier each time. By year 2, he developed a profile for perfect targets. Solo travelers, preferably women, preferably people who looked uncomfortable with conflict. He'd approach with official language about violations, restrictions, prohibited zones. The confusion on their faces always came first, then the fear, then the compliance. Most people paid between $200 and $1,000 just to make him go away. 17 successful extractions in the past 8 months. Not a single complaint filed. Marcus had started thinking of it as a side business, tax-free income that supplemented his security salary nicely. His wife didn't ask where the extra money came from. His daughter's private school tuition got paid on time. The new mortgage on the house in Queens was manageable now. And tonight, tired from a long shift and already thinking about the weekend, Marcus spotted exactly what he was looking for. The pregnant black woman standing near gate 7 checked every box in his mental profile. She was alone, no companion visible anywhere nearby. The designer purse hanging from her shoulder looked expensive, the kind of leather that cost more than his monthly car payment. She wore a cream-colored dress that accommodated her obvious pregnancy, and even from a distance, Marcus could see the fatigue in the way she stood, one hand pressed to her lower back. Pregnant women were ideal targets for specific reasons. They didn't want physical confrontation. They were already anxious about safety. They had money for baby expenses, which meant they had money for fines. And they universally wanted to avoid stress that might affect the pregnancy. This one looked like she'd pay $1,000 easily, maybe $1,500 if he pushed. Marcus checked his watch. 6:58. His shift ended at 7, but this would take maybe 5 minutes. Quick transaction, pocket the cash, head home. Easy money. He adjusted his badge, straightened his uniform, and started across the terminal floor with a practiced walk of someone who had every right to interrupt her evening. What Marcus didn't know, couldn't have known, was that at that exact moment, Chun Min-jun was moving through customs with his security detail, already thinking about the surprise he'd planned for his wife when he got home, completely unaware that she'd surprised him first. What Marcus also didn't know was that the expensive purse he'd noticed wasn't expensive because the woman had money. It was expensive because her husband owned the company that made it, along with about 40 other companies across 3 continents, most of them legitimate, some of them very much not. But Marcus would learn all of this soon enough. He closed the distance between them, his face already arranged in the expression of stern authority that usually made people nervous, and prepared to deliver the opening line he'd used successfully 17 times before. What happened in the next 60 seconds would set in motion a chain of events that would destroy his career, his marriage, his financial security, and his freedom. But right now, Marcus Green thought he was just doing what he'd done 17 times before. Right now, he thought this was just another easy score. Chioma was checking her phone for the 3rd time in as many minutes when she felt someone standing too close. She looked up and found herself facing a security officer, middle-aged white man with a gut that strained against his uniform shirt and eyes that didn't match his official expression. Something about him immediately set off alarm bells in her mind. The same instinct that had made her successful in the financial world where reading people meant survival. "Ma'am, you're standing in a restricted zone." His voice carried the weight of authority, but underneath it Chioma heard something else. Rehearsal. Like he'd said these exact words many times before. She glanced around, confused. She'd specifically chosen this spot because it was clearly within the public waiting area, well away from any security checkpoints or restricted access points. The families standing 15 feet away on either side weren't being bothered. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't think this is restricted. I made sure to stay in the public area." Chioma kept her voice polite but firm. Years of negotiating with men who thought they could intimidate her had taught her that politeness didn't require surrender. Marcus's expression hardened slightly. This was the moment when most people backed down, when the uniform did its work. "Are you arguing with airport security, ma'am?" Several nearby travelers glanced over, then quickly looked away. Chioma noticed the reactions, the way people suddenly became very interested in their phones or the arrivals board. The universal desire not to get involved. "I'm not arguing, I'm just explaining that I don't believe I'm violating any regulation." Chioma shifted her weight, her lower back protesting. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing her stress. "I'm waiting for my husband's flight. I can move if you tell me where the proper waiting area is." Marcus stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly calculated to intimidate. Chioma could smell coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "The proper waiting area is outside the terminal. This zone requires authorization. The fine is $1,000, payable immediately, or I call federal agents to escort you out." $1,000. The number was so absurd that Chioma almost laughed. This wasn't about regulations or restricted zones. This was extortion, plain and simple. She'd seen enough corruption in her years working in international finance to recognize a shakedown when she encountered one. But she was also 7 months pregnant, exhausted from the taxi ride, and suddenly very aware of how isolated she felt despite being surrounded by people. Every nearby traveler had turned away, creating a bubble of forced privacy around the confrontation. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not paying a fine for standing in a public area. If you'd like me to move, I'll move, but I'm not giving you money." Chioma's voice remained steady, but her heart was racing now. Not from fear of this man, but from anger at the audacity, and from the sudden realization that she was more vulnerable than she'd thought. She'd gotten so used to the protection that came with being Chun's wife, the way people treated her differently once they knew whose last name she carried, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as powerless. Marcus saw her hesitation and mistook it for weakness. This was the moment when they usually folded. The moment when the reality of arguing with airport security in a post-9/11 world made them reach for their wallets. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time. Pay the fine or I'm calling federal agents. We can do this easy or we can do this hard, but either way, you're going to comply." Chioma felt the baby kick again, harder this time, and made a decision. Not to pay because she was afraid of this corrupt officer, but because she didn't want stress that might trigger early labor. Because sometimes choosing your battles means knowing which ones aren't worth the physical cost. She started to reach for her purse, already thinking about reporting this man to his supervisor, already planning the complaint she'd file once Chun's plane landed. But then Marcus made his fatal mistake. He grabbed her collar. "You think you're special?" The words came out harsh, his patience apparently exhausted by her moment of consideration. "You think you can just argue with me?" His hand was rough in the fabric of her dress, pulling her slightly forward, and for a split second Chioma was too shocked to react. Then he shoved her backward. The world tilted. Chioma felt her balance go, felt her body moving in a direction she hadn't intended, felt her hand fly to her belly in pure protective instinct while her other hand reached for something, anything to stop the fall that was coming. Her shoulder hit the pillar first, then her hip, the impact sending a spike of pain through her side that made her gasp. She managed to keep from falling completely, catching herself against the cold metal, but the damage was done. Pain radiated from where she'd hit, sharp and immediate. And underneath it, a different kind of pain, deeper, more frightening. A tightening across her abdomen that she recognized from a high-risk pregnancy literature she'd read obsessively. Contractions. The terminal had gone silent. That particular silence that happens when something terrible occurs in public and everyone freezes, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they didn't see. Chioma looked up at Marcus through tears she refused to let fall and saw him standing over her, his fist still clenched in her dress, his face showing irritation rather than concern. "Now pay the fine or get arrested," he said, and his voice was so casual, so practiced, that Chioma understood this wasn't the first time he put his hands on someone. This was just the first time he put his hands on the wrong person's wife. Because at that exact moment, 30 feet away, Chun Min-jun was emerging from customs with his security detail flanking him like shadows in expensive suits, and the first thing he saw was the crowd. Then he saw the uniform. Then he saw her. And everything inside him went cold and lethal. Chun Min-jun had been thinking about Chioma's face when he got home and showed her the ultrasound photo he'd had enhanced by a medical imaging specialist in Seoul. Thinking about how her eyes would light up when she saw their daughter's features more clearly than any standard ultrasound could show. He'd been negotiating territory agreements for 2 weeks, meetings with men who spoke in careful euphemisms about operations that were anything but careful. Expansion into new markets. Consolidation of existing networks. The delicate dance of organized crime at the international level. It had been exhausting but successful, and Chun was already looking forward to being home, to the quiet of the penthouse and Chioma's presence and the simple peace of resting his hand on her belly while their daughter kicked against his palm. Park walked slightly ahead of him, scanning the arrivals hall with the automatic threat assessment of someone who'd spent 20 years in special forces before private security. The rest of the detail fanned out in practiced formation, for men in tailored black suits who looked like corporate executives and moved like soldiers. The terminal was crowded for a Friday evening, the usual chaos of international arrivals. Chun barely noticed any of it, his mind already shifting from business mode to the carefully maintained separation he kept between his work and his home life. Then Park stopped walking. It was subtle, just a half-step hesitation, but Chun had worked with him long enough to know that Park never stopped without reason. "Sir." Park's voice was quiet, controlled, but Chun heard the edge underneath. 10 o'clock, near the pillar. Chun's eyes followed the direction and found the crowd first. A circle of travelers standing frozen, watching something with the horrified fascination of people witnessing an accident. Then he saw the uniform. Airport security, brown shirt, badge visible even from this distance. Then he saw the man's hand, clenched in fabric, pulling someone. And then he saw her face. Time didn't slow down. That's a myth people tell about moments of crisis. Time moved exactly as it always did, relentless and unchanging. But Chun's perception sharpened, focusing with absolute clarity on details that would normally blur together. Chioma's cream-colored dress, the same one she'd worn to dinner last month when they'd celebrated the pregnancy, making it past the dangerous second trimester. Her hair pulled back with the silver clip he'd brought her from Tokyo. The curve of her belly, 7 months of carrying his daughter. One hand pressed protectively over that belly. The other hand against a pillar, holding herself up. The security officer's fist in her collar. The way she'd clearly just been pushed, her body's position still recovering from impact. The pain on her face. Everything inside Chun that was civilized, everything that had learned to function in society, everything that passed for human in business meetings and social situations, simply evaporated. What remained was something older and much more dangerous. Park felt the change immediately. 15 years of working together had taught him to recognize the shift, the moment when Chun stopped being a businessman and became something else entirely. He'd seen it maybe 5 times before, and each time had ended with someone dying or wishing they had. "Sir, wait." Park's hand moved toward Chun's arm, not to restrain but to ground, to remind him they were in public, that there were cameras, that federal agents patrolled this terminal. Chun's voice came out like gravel scraping against stone, barely above a whisper but carrying absolute finality. "Remove your hand." Park immediately stepped back, and Chun started moving. Not running. Running would draw attention, would trigger security responses, would waste seconds in dealing with interruption. He walked with purpose, his security detail falling into formation around him automatically, and every step brought him closer to the man whose life expectancy had just shortened to minutes. Chioma saw him before Marcus did. Her eyes found him across 30 feet of terminal floor, and Chun watched her face cycle through shock, then relief, then something that looked like fear but wasn't fear of Marcus. It was fear of what Chun was about to do. He watched her mouth form his name without sound, watched her shake her head slightly in a gesture he understood was meant to stop him from doing exactly what every instinct was screaming at him to do. But Chun had already crossed a line in his mind, and there was no coming back from it. Marcus was still talking, still had his hand clenched in Chioma's dress, still had that expression of petty authority on his face that suggested he thought he'd won. Chun covered the remaining distance in 4 long strides and spoke 3 words that would echo in Marcus Green's nightmares for years to come. "Remove your hand." Marcus turned toward the interruption with irritation already forming on his face. He'd almost closed this deal, almost had the pregnant woman ready to pay, and now someone was interfering. What he saw made him hesitate. A Korean man stood 5 feet away, wearing a suit that Marcus's brain immediately registered as expensive in a way he couldn't quite define. Perfect tailoring, fabric that caught light differently than normal wool, details that whispered wealth rather than shouted it. But it was the man's face that made Marcus's hand loosen slightly on Chioma's dress. There's a specific expression humans evolved to recognize as danger. It's printed in our DNA from millions of years of needing to know when a predator is looking at us. Not anger, which is hot and reactive. This was something colder. Calculation. The face of something deciding exactly how to hurt you. Chun Min-jun's expression held that calculation now, his eyes locked on Marcus with an intensity that made the security officer's survival instincts start screaming warnings his conscious mind was still processing. Behind the Korean man, 4 others in identical black suits spread out with military precision, moving to positions that Marcus dimly recognized as tactical positioning, cutting off exit routes, establishing control of the space. "I said remove your hand." Chun's voice was quiet, almost conversational, and somehow that made it more terrifying than if he'd been shouting. Marcus did let go then, his fingers releasing Chioma's dress as he took a half-step backward. But his pride and his badge and 12 years of having authority respected made him try to salvage the situation. "Sir, this is a security matter. I'm going to have to ask you to step back while I handle this situation with the passenger." He used his official voice, the one that usually made people comply, the one backed by the assumption that airport security had real power. Chun took 3 steps forward. Not aggressive steps. Measured steps. The kind of movement that showed absolute confidence, the certainty that nothing Marcus could do would change what was about to happen. "The passenger," Chun said quietly, "is my wife." Marcus felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. Wife. The word rearranged his entire understanding of the situation in a fraction of a second. The expensive purse suddenly made sense. The way she'd argued instead of immediately folding made sense. And the man in the suit that probably cost more than Marcus's car suddenly made terrifying sense. "Sir, I was just explaining the regulations about restricted zones." Marcus heard his own voice shift, trying to recalibrate, trying to sound reasonable, but the damage was done and they both knew it. "If there was a misunderstanding, I apologize, but she was standing in a prohibited area, and when I attempted to explain the fine, she became argumentative." Behind him, Marcus heard Park speak quietly into a phone in Korean, but the tone needed no translation. Someone was being called. Multiple someones, based on the series of brief conversations. Chun's eyes hadn't left Marcus's face. "You put your hands on her." It wasn't a question. "Sir, I may have guided her away from the restricted zone for her own safety, but I never intended any harm. If she felt that I was too forceful, I apologize. These situations can be stressful and sometimes physical guidance is necessary when passengers don't comply with direct instructions." Marcus was talking faster now, his brain throwing out excuses and justifications in the desperate hope that one of them would land, that this situation could be de-escalated before it became something worse. But Chun wasn't listening to the words. He was watching Chioma, who had one hand pressed to her belly and the other against the pillar, her face tight with pain that had nothing to do with embarrassment. "Yobo," Chun said softly, switching to Korean. "Are you hurt?" Chioma nodded slightly, and Chun watched her face, reading what she wasn't saying out loud. The way she held her belly. The careful way she was breathing. The tension in her jaw that meant she was trying not to show how much pain she was in. When Chun looked back at Marcus, something had shifted. The cold calculation was still there, but underneath it now was fury so absolute that it made the air feel dangerous. Park. Chun didn't raise his voice. Call Dr. Chun. Tell her we're coming to the hospital. Possible early contractions. Park was already dialing, moving toward Chioma with the careful concern of someone who'd been present for every ultrasound appointment, who'd spent 6 months listening to Chun talk about the pregnancy and the baby and his terror of something going wrong. Sir, if there's a medical situation, I can call airport medical services. Marcus tried one more time to regain control, to make this about official procedures and his authority. Chun finally looked at him again, and Marcus realized with absolute clarity that he was looking at someone who could have him killed without raising his voice or getting his hands dirty. Whatever he'd thought this man was, whoever he'd assumed based on appearance, he'd been catastrophically wrong. You will stand exactly where you are, Chun said quietly. You will not move. You will not speak. You will not attempt to leave. If you do any of those things, the consequences will be immediate and severe. Do you understand? Marcus nodded, his throat too dry to speak. 2 of Chun's security detail moved to flank Marcus, not touching him but standing close enough to ensure compliance. The other 2 moved to Chioma, creating a protective barrier between her and anyone who might interfere. Chun crossed to his wife, his hands gentle as he touched her face, tilted it up to meet his eyes. When he spoke this time, his voice was completely different. Soft. Worried. Human in a way that made Marcus understand he'd somehow managed to find the one person in this entire terminal that this dangerous man actually cared about, and he'd put his hands on her. Why are you here, Chioma? You were supposed to be home resting. There was no anger in the question, just concern and the specific fear of someone who'd been counting days until a high-risk pregnancy was safely delivered. I missed you, Chioma said simply, and then her face tightened with pain again, her hand pressing harder against her belly. Chun's jaw clenched, and when he looked back at Marcus one more time, his expression made the security officer's bladder clench with pure animal fear. You have no idea what you've done, Chun said softly. But you will learn. I promise you that. Then he turned his full attention back to Chioma, helping her stand straight, supporting her weight, murmuring in Korean while Park finished the call to the doctor and started clearing a path toward the exit. Marcus stood frozen between 2 men in black suits, watching them leave, and already feeling the first tremors of the earthquake that was about to destroy his entire life. Around him, phones were out. At least a dozen people had filmed the entire confrontation. The footage was probably already uploading to social media, spreading through networks, being seen by people who would recognize the man in the tailored suit and understand exactly who Marcus had just assaulted. He'd done this 17 times before without consequence. This time was different. This time he touched the wrong person's wife. And now there was no going back. The hospital room was too white, too bright, too full of machines that beeped and measured things Chun couldn't control. Dr. Chun had examined Chioma immediately, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by focused professionalism when Park had explained the situation on the phone. Now she was reading monitors, checking vitals, her face carefully neutral in the way doctors practiced when they didn't want to scare their patients. Chun stood next to the bed, holding Chioma's hand, watching the contraction monitor spike and trying not to let her see how terrified he was. 7 months. The baby wasn't supposed to come for another 9 weeks. 9 weeks that could mean the difference between a healthy delivery and a medical crisis, between their daughter breathing on her own and needing machines to survive. The contractions are irregular, Dr. Chun said finally, looking up from her tablet. That's actually good news. If this was active labor, they'd be regular and increasing in frequency. What we're seeing looks more like stress-induced cramping. Braxton Hicks contractions on steroids, essentially. But she's in pain. Chun's voice came out rougher than intended. I am in pain, Chioma corrected, squeezing his hand. I'm also right here and capable of speaking for myself. Dr. Chun smiled slightly. The pain is real, but it's not necessarily dangerous. Your body is upset about the physical stress and it's reacting. We're going to keep you here for observation, run a full panel, check the baby's heart rate and position, make sure there's no placental damage from the impact. Impact, Chun repeated, the word tasting like acid. A man shoved my pregnant wife in a public airport. Dr. Chen's expression hardened. Yes, Park explained the situation. For what it's worth, I'll be documenting everything medically, and this documentation can be used in any legal proceedings you choose to pursue. Oh, I'm pursuing legal proceedings, Chun said quietly. Among other things. Chioma looked at him, and he saw understanding in her eyes. Understanding and concern. She knew him well enough to know that other things meant much more than lawsuits. Yobo, she said softly, using the Korean term of endearment that always made his chest ache. I'm okay. The baby is okay. Dr. Chun said so. She said probably okay, Chun corrected, unable to keep the edge from his voice. She said we need to wait and observe and check. None of those words mean okay. None of those words mean not okay either. Chioma pulled his hand to her belly, pressed it against the curve where their daughter was currently doing what felt like gymnastics, apparently unbothered by the crisis happening around her. Feel that? She's fine. Angry, maybe. Takes after her father. Dr. Chen tactfully excused herself to order tests, leaving them alone in the too-white room with its beeping machines and chemical smells. Chun sat on the edge of the bed, both hands on Chioma's belly now, feeling their daughter kick and roll and protest the confined space. The movement should have been reassuring. It was reassuring. But it didn't erase the image burned into his mind of that security officer's hand clenched in her dress, of her body hitting the pillar, of the pain on her face. You shouldn't have come to the airport, he said finally. I know. I specifically told you to stay home. Dr. Chun told you to stay home. This pregnancy is high risk, and you know that means being careful about everything. I know, Chioma repeated, and there was no defensiveness in her voice, just acknowledgement. So why did you come? She was quiet for a moment, her hand covering his on her belly. Because I was lonely, she said simply. Because 2 weeks felt like forever. Because I wanted to see your face when you walked through those doors. Because I love you and I missed you and I made a choice based on emotion instead of logic, which is apparently something I do when you're not around to be logical for both of us. Chun closed his eyes, fighting the war between his fury at the situation and his complete inability to be angry at her for anything. If something had happened to you. If the baby had, he couldn't finish the sentence. But nothing happened to me that can't be managed. And the baby is fine. Chioma's voice was gentle but firm. What did happen is that a corrupt security officer assaulted a pregnant woman, and from what I saw of his reaction when you showed up, this wasn't his first time. Park is already investigating. Chun opened his eyes, refocusing. My lawyers are pulling airport surveillance footage. My tech team is collecting all the phone videos that were uploaded to social media. And I have people finding out everything there is to know about Marcus Green, including things he probably wishes would stay hidden. And then what? It was a simple question, but Chun heard the real question underneath it. How far are you going to take this? Where does justice end and revenge begin? Who are you going to be in response to this? And then I'm going to destroy him, Chun said quietly. Systematically, completely, in ways that ensure he never has the opportunity to do this to anyone else. Legally. Chun met her eyes. Among other methods. Chun. She said his name like a warning and a plea at the same time. He put his hands on you, Chioma. He shoved you while you were pregnant. He could have triggered premature labor. He could have caused placental abruption. He could have killed our daughter. The words came out harsh despite his attempt at control. And from his reaction, from the way he spoke, this was routine for him. Which means he's done this before to other people who didn't have the resources to fight back. So fight back legally. Press charges. File lawsuits. Use that footage to end his career and put him in prison. Chioma's hand tightened on his. But don't become the villain in this story by going too far. Chun was quiet for a long moment, looking at their joined hands, feeling their daughter move under his palm. "There's a version of me," he said finally, "that you've never really seen. The version that built what I built, that controls what I control, that makes men afraid by reputation alone. That version doesn't do restraint well." "I know exactly who you are," Chioma said firmly. "I've always known. I didn't fall in love with a gentleman. But I fell in love with a man who's capable of choosing to be gentle when it matters. Don't lose that just because someone hurt us." Outside the hospital room, Park was coordinating with lawyers and investigators, and somewhere in Queens, Marcus Green was probably just starting to understand how badly he'd miscalculated. But in this moment, in this too-white room with its beeping machines, Chun made a decision. He would destroy Marcus Green's career, his credibility, his freedom. He would ensure the man faced every legal consequence available. He would make certain that what happened to Chioma could never happen to another traveler in that airport. But he would try to do it without becoming something his daughter would be ashamed of when she was old enough to understand. "Okay," he said quietly. "We do this legally. Mostly." Chioma raised an eyebrow. "Mostly." "I'm not a saint, Yobo. But I'll try to be better than my worst instincts." He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "For you. And for her." The baby kicked hard against his hand, as if agreeing to hold him accountable. If you're wondering how a dangerous man controls his rage long enough to plan perfect revenge, stay with this story because what comes next will show you that sometimes the coldest fury is the most effective. Marcus Green made it home before the walls started closing in. His shift had ended an hour after the incident, and his supervisor had pulled him aside with questions about a confrontation that had been reported by multiple witnesses. Marcus had given his standard explanation about a passenger in a restricted zone, a minor physical guidance that had been misinterpreted, a husband who'd overreacted to a routine security procedure. His supervisor had looked skeptical but hadn't pushed. There was no formal complaint yet. Just witness statements and some social media chatter. Nothing official. Marcus had driven home to Queens believing he'd weathered another close call. That belief lasted until he walked into his kitchen and saw his wife Sharon's face. "You need to see something," she said quietly, and turned her laptop toward him. The video had 17,000 views already. Shot from someone's phone, slightly shaky but crystal clear. It showed Marcus grabbing a pregnant woman's collar. Showed him shoving her backward. Showed her hitting the pillar, one hand flying to her belly in a gesture that was unmistakably protective. The caption read "Airport security assaults pregnant woman," and the comments were brutal. Marcus felt his stomach drop. "They're calling you by name," Sharon said, and her voice was carefully controlled in the way it got when she was furious but trying not to show it. "Someone identified your badge number. They're posting your supervisor's contact information, the airport's complaint line, the Federal Aviation Authority's Oversight Department." Marcus sank into a chair, his hands shaking slightly. 17,000 views. That was more than just passengers who'd witnessed it. That was people sharing it, spreading it, making it viral. "It's not what it looks like," he started, but Sharon held up her hand. "Don't. I've been married to you for 15 years, Marcus. I know when you're lying." She closed the laptop with more force than necessary. "What I don't know is when you became someone who puts his hands on pregnant women." She was in a restricted zone. She was argumentative. "I was trying to maintain order." "You were trying to extort her." Sharon's voice was flat. "How many times have you done this? How many people have you bullied into paying you money for violations that don't exist?" Marcus opened his mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Because Sharon knew. She'd probably known for a while, had probably chosen not to ask questions about the extra money that made their lives easier, had probably rationalized it the same way he had. But there was video now. Evidence. Proof that couldn't be explained away. His phone rang. The supervisor's number. Marcus let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately. A number he didn't recognize. He declined the call. Then it started vibrating continuously. Calls, texts, notifications, social media mentions, news alerts. The video spreading across platforms, being picked up by local news accounts, being shared by advocacy groups that focused on airport security abuse. 18 hours after he'd shoved Chioma Ejiofor against a pillar, Marcus's phone finally stopped ringing long enough for him to check his messages. What he found made his blood run cold. 47 missed calls, 216 texts, and 3 voicemails that mattered more than all the rest combined. The first was from his supervisor, informing him he was suspended pending investigation. The second was from his bank, informing him that his mortgage was being called due to undisclosed violations in his financial disclosure. The third was from his daughter's private school, informing him that due to unforeseen circumstances her scholarship was being revoked effective immediately. Marcus sat in his kitchen, phone in hand, and felt the first real tremor of fear. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Someone was taking his life apart piece by piece, and he had a pretty good idea who. Meanwhile, in a hospital room across the city, Park was briefing Chun on the investigation's findings. Marcus Green, 46 years old, airport security for 12 years. Married, 1 daughter in private school. Mortgage on a house in Queens that's underwater by about $40,000. Wife works in hospitality management at a hotel that's owned by a subsidiary of one of your holding companies. Chun listened without expression, one hand resting on Chioma's belly while she dozed, sedatives helping her rest while the doctors continued monitoring. The interesting part, Park continued, is that we've identified 17 other incidents in the past 8 months where Green appeared to extort travelers. Different amounts, different pretexts, but the same pattern. Solo travelers, often women, often people who looked vulnerable or unlikely to complain. Witnesses. We found 6 people willing to give statements. 2 elderly tourists, 3 women traveling alone, 1 man with a disability. All of them paid rather than argue. None of them filed complaints because they didn't think anyone would believe them over an airport security officer. Chun's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened slightly on Chioma's belly. And his supervisor? Received complaints about Green twice in the past year. Dismissed both as misunderstandings. We're still investigating whether the supervisor was actively complicit or just negligently incompetent. I want both of them destroyed, Chun said quietly. Green for what he did, and the supervisor for enabling it. Park nodded. The lawyers have already filed criminal complaints with airport police and federal authorities. Assault, extortion, abuse of authority. The district attorney's office received the video evidence this morning, along with statements from all 6 previous victims we located. And the other matters? Park's expression remained neutral, but Chun saw the slight hesitation. His mortgage is held by a bank that your finance network has significant leverage over. The bank has already initiated foreclosure procedures based on financial disclosure violations. His wife's employer received an anonymous tip about potential compliance issues that will result in her termination within 48 hours. His daughter's scholarship was funded through a foundation that one of your shell companies controls. That funding has been redirected to other recipients. These were the other methods that Chun had mentioned to Chioma. The extra-legal pressure that could be applied when you controlled enough pieces of the economic ecosystem to make someone's life systematically collapse. Good, Chun said. Continue. Sir. Park's voice was careful. Your wife asked for restraint. I am being restrained. I haven't had him killed. Chun looked up from Chioma's sleeping face. But I will not allow this man to continue existing in the same reality where he thought he could put his hands on her. He wanted to use his power to make vulnerable people suffer. Now he's going to learn what it feels like when someone with real power decides to make him suffer. Park nodded and left to continue coordinating the systematic destruction of Marcus Green's life. Chun sat in the hospital room, watching Chioma breathe, feeling their daughter move, and thought about the conversation they'd had about justice versus revenge. He was trying. He really was trying to be the man she wanted him to be, the man their daughter would need him to be. But Marcus Green had crossed a line that Chun couldn't uncross in his mind, had triggered something primal and protective that didn't respond well to concepts like mercy or proportional response. So he'd compromise. He'd let the legal system do its work. He'd stay within boundaries that could be justified. But he'd also make sure that when Marcus Green lay awake at night for the rest of his life, he'd remember the pregnant woman in the airport and understand exactly how much it had cost him to make that one terrible choice. Sometimes justice and revenge looked the same from the outside. Chun was choosing to believe this was justice. 3 weeks passed in a blur of hospital visits, legal proceedings, and media attention that Marcus Green could never have anticipated. The video had gone fully viral, picked up by major news networks, dissected by legal analysts, shared millions of times across social media platforms. It became a symbol of airport security overreach, of the vulnerability of pregnant women, of corruption hiding behind uniforms and badges. Marcus's face was everywhere. His name became shorthand for abuse of authority. Advocacy groups used his image in campaigns about protecting travelers' rights. And while the public destruction was happening, the private devastation was worse. The federal investigation moved with shocking speed, driven by evidence that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Previous victims came forward, encouraged by the attention the case was receiving. Security footage that should have been deleted from airport servers mysteriously appeared in prosecutors' hands, showing Marcus's pattern of targeting vulnerable travelers. His bank accounts were frozen pending investigation into the source of unexplained deposits. His mortgage went into foreclosure. Sharon filed for separation, taking their daughter to live with her sister in Connecticut. Marcus's supervisor was fired and charged as an accessory, his own corruption exposed by an audit that discovered 3 years of kickback payments that had somehow escaped detection until now. And through it all, Marcus knew exactly who was behind the pieces that didn't make sense. The evidence that appeared too conveniently. The doors that closed too quickly. The pressure that came from directions that had nothing to do with standard law enforcement procedures. Chun Min-jun never contacted him directly. Never made threats or demands. But Marcus felt his presence in every closed door, every denied appeal, every piece of his life that systematically fell apart. Now, 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus stood in his empty house in Queens and waited for the federal marshals he knew were coming. The criminal charges had been filed yesterday. Assault in the 2nd degree. Attempted extortion. Multiple counts of official misconduct. Abuse of authority. The indictment was 17 pages long and detailed a pattern of behavior that would likely result in significant prison time if convicted. His lawyer had advised taking a plea deal. The prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. The video alone would convict him, but combined with testimony from 8 victims, airport security footage, and financial records showing unexplained cash deposits, there was no defense. Marcus had refused. Not because he thought he could win, but because he was too numb to care anymore. His phone buzzed. The marshals were outside. He thought about running. He thought about fighting. He thought about a lot of things in those final moments of freedom. But mostly he thought about the pregnant woman's face when he grabbed her collar, the moment before he'd shoved her, when she'd looked at him with more disappointment than fear, like she'd expected better from someone in a position of authority. He'd spent 12 years believing that his badge gave him power, that uniform and authority were the same thing, that vulnerable people deserved whatever happened to them because they were weak. And then he put his hands on someone who turned out to be protected by real power. The kind that didn't need a badge or a uniform, the kind that could dismantle your entire existence while barely raising its voice. The knock on the door was professional. Authoritative. Marcus opened it to find 2 federal marshals, both professional and polite, explaining that he was under arrest and reading him his rights. He didn't resist. Didn't argue. Just held out his hands for the cuffs and let them lead him outside where news cameras were already waiting. Because of course someone had tipped off the media about exactly when and where this arrest would happen. More humiliation. More public exposure. More evidence that whoever was orchestrating this destruction wanted Marcus's fall to be as complete and visible as possible. As the marshals put him in the car, Marcus caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, like the uniform had been holding him up, and without it he was just a middle-aged man who'd made catastrophic choices and was now facing the consequences. The car pulled away from his house, from the life he'd built on corruption and small cruelties, and Marcus realized something that should have been obvious from the start. He'd never had power. He just had the illusion of it, borrowed authority that evaporated the moment someone with actual power decided to take it away. Real power was what Chun Min-jun had. The ability to dismantle someone's life from a hospital room without raising his voice. The resources to ensure that justice or revenge, or whatever this was, happened efficiently and completely. Real power was what Chioma had. The strength to tell her husband to stop halfway, to draw a moral line that even a dangerous man would respect. Marcus had just been a bully in a uniform, and bullies only succeed until someone stronger decides to stop them. Meanwhile, at a private penthouse overlooking the city, Chioma sat on the couch with her feet up, doctor's orders still requiring rest even though the contractions had stopped and the baby was showing no signs of distress. Chun sat next to her, laptop open, watching the news coverage of Marcus Green's arrest. "It's done," he said quietly. Chioma didn't ask what he meant. She knew. The legal case, the career destruction, the financial ruin, the public humiliation. All of it was complete. "How do you feel?" she asked instead. Chun was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "Satisfied," he said finally. "But not happy. I wanted him to suffer more, and I'm choosing not to make that happen, which feels like restraint even though I know it's just basic decency." "That's growth," Chioma said gently. "It's compromise." Chun closed the laptop. "I'm compromising between what I want to do and what you ask me to do, and I'm calling it growth because that sounds better." Chioma smiled slightly. "Honesty is also growth." "I destroyed a man's entire life," Chun said, looking at her. "I used resources and connections that most people don't have access to, and I applied them systematically to ensure that Marcus Green will spend years in prison, will lose everything he owns, will have his name permanently associated with corruption and violence. And I did it not because the justice system required it, but because he touched you." "Yes," Chioma agreed. "You did all of that. And I should feel worse about it than I do." Chun's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining automatically. "But every time I start to feel guilty, I remember your face when he shoved you. I remember the contractions. I remember sitting in that hospital room terrified that our daughter might come too early because some corrupt security guard decided you looked like an easy target. So you feel justified." "I feel like I did what needed to be done." Chun brought her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles. "Which isn't the same as feeling good about it." The baby kicked hard, making Chioma wince slightly. Chun's hand immediately went to her belly, feeling their daughter's movement, the reassurance that she was safe and healthy and completely unaware of the drama happening in the adult world. "There's going to be hearings," Chioma said. "Congressional investigations into airport security procedures. They're calling it Chioma's Law, legislation to protect travelers from corrupt officers, mandatory body cameras, anonymous complaint systems, federal oversight." I know. Chun had read the proposals, had even quietly funded some of the advocacy groups pushing for reform. "So something good came from this," Chioma continued. "Not just Marcus getting punished, but actual systemic change that might prevent this from happening to other people. Is that supposed to make me feel better about the methods I used?" "No." Chioma shifted position, trying to get comfortable with 30 pounds of baby pressing on her internal organs. "It's supposed to remind you that sometimes the right outcome doesn't erase the questionable path you took to get there. You can acknowledge both things at once." This was what Chun loved about her, this ability to hold complexity without needing simple answers. She didn't need him to be purely good or purely bad. She just needed him to be honest about which one he was being at any given moment. "I'm not a good man," he said quietly. "I know," Chioma agreed. "But you're trying to be better than you were. That counts for something." Outside, the city sprawled in all directions, full of people who knew Chun's name and reputation, who made assumptions about who he was based on rumors and speculation and the careful image he maintained. But in this room, with this woman, he could be honest about the darkness in him and the constant choice to keep it controlled. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Chun thought about the daughter who would be born in 6 weeks if everything went according to plan. The daughter who would grow up knowing her father's real business, who would have to make her own choices about what to do with that knowledge. He hoped she'd be more like Chioma than like him. Strong without needing to prove it. Confident without needing to dominate. Capable of mercy even when revenge felt more satisfying. But if she turned out to be like him, he hoped someone would love her enough to make her want to be better. The way Chioma made him want to be better every single day. 6 weeks later, at exactly 38 weeks and 2 days into the pregnancy, Chioma's water broke at 3 in the morning. Chun woke to her hand shaking his shoulder and the words "it's time" spoken with remarkable calmness for someone about to give birth. The next 12 hours were a blur of hospital rooms, contractions, doctors and nurses moving with practiced efficiency, and Chun discovering that all his power and resources and capacity for control meant absolutely nothing when facing the reality of childbirth. He couldn't negotiate with labor. Couldn't intimidate the pain away. Couldn't make phone calls that would speed up the process or reduce Chioma's suffering. All he could do was hold her hand, breathe when she told him to breathe, and feel completely useless while she did the hardest work she'd ever done. Dr. Chun was there, steady and encouraging, providing running commentary on dilation and effacement and all the medical terminology that Chun had studied obsessively but still didn't really understand. Park waited outside with the security detail, ready to ensure the hospital floor remained secure and private. Chun's family had been notified but asked to wait until after the delivery, per Chioma's wishes that the first hours be just the three of them. At 2:47 in the afternoon, after 9 hours of labor that felt like 9 years, their daughter entered the world screaming her displeasure at the cold air and bright lights. She was perfect. 7 pounds, 3 ounces, 20 inches long. Full head of black hair. Lungs that worked exactly as they should, filling the delivery room with a sound of healthy outrage. The nurse placed her on Chioma's chest, and Chun watched his wife's face transform into something he'd never seen before. Joy so pure it hurt to witness. "Hi, baby," Chioma whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Hi, sweet girl. We've been waiting for you." Chun couldn't speak. Could barely breathe. Just stared at this tiny human who'd been an abstract concept for 9 months and was now suddenly terrifyingly real. His daughter. The nurse gave them privacy for the first hour, what they called the golden hour of skin-to-skin contact and initial bonding. Chioma held their daughter while Chun sat on the edge of the bed, one finger wrapped in a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone who'd only existed outside the womb for 30 minutes. "She has your eyes," Chioma said softly. "She has your stubbornness," Chun replied, watching their daughter's face scrunch up in preparation for another complaint about existence. "She's been outside for half an hour and she's already angry about everything. Takes after her father," Chioma teased, the same words she'd used in the hospital room 3 weeks ago. Chun finally found his voice. "I'm terrified." "Good," Chioma said. "Anyone who isn't terrified of being responsible for another human's entire existence probably shouldn't be a parent." Their daughter made a small sound, not quite a cry but definitely an expression of opinion about being discussed like she wasn't right there. Chun touched her tiny hand, watched her fingers curl reflexively, and felt something shift inside him. He'd built an empire on fear and control. Had spent 20 years making sure he was the most dangerous person in any room. Had cultivated a reputation that made strong men nervous and weak men run. But this 7-pound human with her mother's face and his eyes had just reduced him to complete vulnerability in 30 seconds. She was his weakness. His soft spot. The thing that enemies would target if they wanted to hurt him. And he would burn the world down to keep her safe. Chioma must have read his expression because she said quietly, "You can't protect her from everything." "Watch me," Chun replied, but without the edge of threat he usually carried. Just honest determination. "She's going to grow up and make choices you don't agree with. She's going to take risks and get hurt and fall in love with people you don't approve of." Chioma shifted their daughter slightly, adjusting the blanket. "And you're going to have to let her, because protection without freedom is just another kind of prison." Chun knew she was right. Knew that the same impulse that had made him want to destroy Marcus Green would make him want to eliminate any threat to his daughter's safety or happiness. But he also knew that Chioma would be there to remind him of the difference between protection and control. Would help him navigate the impossible balance between keeping their daughter safe and letting her live. "We're naming her Min Seo," he said. using the Korean name they'd chosen together. It meant auspicious and calm, which felt aspirational given how loudly she'd entered the world. Min-seo Egyo for Chun, Chioma agreed, trying out the full name. Think she'll live up to it? No chance, Chun said, but he was smiling. She's going to be chaos and stubbornness and probably gray hair for both of us by the time she's 16. Good, Chioma said firmly. Obedient children are overrated. Min-seo chose that moment to open her eyes for the first time, dark and alert, looking directly at her father with an intensity that suggested she was already cataloging everything for future reference. Chun looked back at his daughter and made a silent promise that he'd try to be the father she deserved. Not perfect, because perfection was impossible, but better. Always trying to be better than his worst instincts, more controlled than his rage, more thoughtful than his pride. He'd probably fail sometimes. Would probably make choices that Chioma would have to talk him down from. Would probably struggle with the difference between protection and control for the rest of his life. But he'd try. And maybe that was enough. 2 months later, Marcus Green stood in a federal courtroom and heard the judge sentence him to 4 years in prison for assault, extortion, and abuse of authority. He'd taken the plea deal eventually, once his lawyer made it clear that going to trial would only result in a longer sentence. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence, including testimony from 12 victims who'd come forward after seeing the viral video. The judge had been harsh in her remarks, talking about betrayal of public trust and the particular vulnerability of the woman Marcus had targeted. She'd referenced the footage, the contractions it had triggered, the potential for tragedy that had been narrowly avoided. Marcus had stood there and taken it because there was nothing else to do. His life as he'd known it was over. His career gone. His marriage destroyed. His reputation permanently ruined. 4 years in prison was just the official consequence on top of all the unofficial ones that had already happened. As the marshals led him away, Marcus caught sight of someone in the gallery. A Korean man in an expensive suit, holding a baby carrier with a sleeping infant inside. Next to him sat the pregnant woman from the airport, no longer pregnant, watching the proceedings with calm attention. They'd come to see his sentencing. Not gloating. Not celebrating. Just witnessing the completion of the process they'd started. Chun Min-jun met Marcus's eyes for one brief moment, and Marcus saw no anger there. No satisfaction. Just acknowledgement that this was how it had to end. Then the marshals led Marcus through the side door, and he didn't look back. Outside the courthouse, Chun carried Min-seo's car seat while Chioma walked beside him, moving carefully after the C-section she'd needed when labor stalled at 8 centimeters. "How do you feel?" she asked, the same question she'd asked him 3 months ago in the penthouse. "Done," Chun said simply. "It's finished." "Good." Chioma looked up at him. "Now we can focus on being parents instead of being victims or prosecutors or whatever we've been for the past few months." Min-seo made a small sound from her carrier, waking up and immediately expressing her opinion about car seats and courthouses and existence in general. "She's hungry," Chioma said, reading their daughter's escalating complaints with the expertise of 2 months' practice. "She's always hungry," Chun observed. "She gets that from you." "She gets her terrible sleep schedule from you," Chioma countered, but she was smiling. They walked to the car where Park was waiting, ready to drive them home to the penthouse and the life they were building together. A life that would always have shadows, would always include the complexity of Chun's business and reputation, and the choices he'd made before Chioma and Min-seo gave him reasons to choose differently. But it would also have light. Joy. The simple ordinary moments of feeding schedules and diaper changes and watching their daughter discover the world. Marcus Green would spend the next 4 years in prison, and afterward would spend the rest of his life carrying the weight of his choices. Chun and Chioma would spend the next 18 years raising a daughter who would probably challenge them in ways they couldn't imagine yet. Both were consequences. Both were deserved. And both were just different ways of learning that every choice has a cost, and the people who pay that cost aren't always the people who made the choice. This story is about power and how we use it. Marcus Green had power borrowed from a badge and a uniform, and he used it to hurt people who couldn't fight back. His downfall wasn't just about justice. It was about the illusion of authority meeting actual power and discovering how little protection a title provides when you've wronged the wrong person. Chun Min-jun had real power, the kind built on fear and control and resources most people never access. He could have killed Marcus. Could have made him disappear. Could have enacted revenge so complete that it erased Marcus from existence. But he chose restraint, not because he was merciful by nature, but because the woman he loved asked him to be better than his worst instincts. That's the harder choice. Revenge is easy. Mercy requires strength. Chioma had a different kind of power, the kind that comes from knowing your own worth regardless of what anyone else thinks. She didn't need rescuing. She just needed justice. And she had the moral clarity to know when justice was crossing into cruelty, and the courage to tell a dangerous man to stop. The real lesson isn't about airport security or corrupt officers or even about pregnant women being vulnerable. It's about recognizing that we all have some kind of power, whether it's authority or wealth or moral clarity or physical strength, and the measure of who we are comes down to how we choose to use it. Do we protect or control? Do we seek justice or revenge? Do we use our power to lift others up or push them down? Marcus used his power to hurt people weaker than himself. He paid for that choice with everything he had. Chun used his power to destroy someone who hurt his family. He'll spend the rest of his life wondering if he took it too far. Chioma used her power to draw a moral line that even a dangerous man respected. She gets to raise a daughter knowing she chose mercy even when revenge felt more satisfying. We all make choices about power every single day. The security guard who decides whether to help or harass. The boss who decides whether to support or undermine. The parent who decides whether to protect or control. The person with resources who decides whether to use them for justice or revenge. Your power might not look like Chun's wealth or Marcus's badge, but you have it. The question is what you're going to do with it. And that choice, more than any law or consequence or punishment, determines who you really are.